German soldiers shocked as black tank commanders Sherman tore through their lines. "You think you can command a tank in my division? They'll eat you alive out there, Lieutenant. With respect, Captain Miller, my crew and I are ready to prove otherwise." The words hung in the frozen air of the Belgian forest, December 1944. Captain Robert Miller stood with his arms crossed, staring at Lieutenant James Carter with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. Around them, the 761st Tank Battalion was preparing for what would become one of the most crucial engagements of the Battle of the Bulge. Snow fell in thick sheets, coating the Sherman tanks in white, making them look like ghosts waiting to haunt the German lines just 3 miles east. Carter stood at attention, his breath visible in the cold, his dark eyes steady and unwavering. He was 24 years old, a graduate of officer candidate school, and he had been waiting his entire military career for this moment. Not the confrontation with Miller, he had faced that kind of skepticism 100 times, but the chance to prove that he belonged here, that he could lead men in combat, that the color of his skin had nothing to do with his ability to command. Miller finally shook his head and walked away, muttering something about regulations and the chain of command. Carter watched him go, then turned to his tank, Sherman number 33. Cool Stud was painted on her side in white letters, courtesy of his loader, Private Jackson. She wasn't much to look at: 30 tons of riveted steel, a 75 main gun, and armor that everyone knew couldn't stop a German 88. But she was his, and his crew trusted him to bring them home. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 weeks earlier when Lieutenant James Carter first arrived at the 761st Tank Battalion staging area in northern France. The convoy of trucks carrying the newly assigned officers rolled through the muddy roads on a gray November morning. Carter sat in the back of a deuce and a half, his duffel bag at his feet, watching the French countryside roll past. He had grown up in Philadelphia, where his father worked in a steel mill and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the main line suburbs. He had been the first in his family to finish high school, and when the war came, he saw it as an opportunity not just to serve his country, but to prove something larger. The Army had other ideas about what men like him could prove. At Fort Hood during training, he had been relegated to quartermaster duties, supply logistics, anything that kept him away from combat commands. It took intervention from his training officer, a white lieutenant from Ohio who believed in merit over melanin, to get Carter into the tank commander pipeline. Even then, he faced obstacles at every turn. Training exercises where his orders were questioned. Inspections that were more thorough than those given to white officers. Casual comments in the officers' mess that made it clear he was tolerated, not welcomed. But Carter had persisted, and now here he was, assigned to the 761st, the Black Panthers, as they called themselves. An all-black tank battalion with white officers in the senior positions, sent to fight in a war for freedom while facing discrimination at every turn. The trucks pulled into the battalion area, and Carter grabbed his bag and jumped down. The place was organized chaos, tanks being maintained, ammunition being loaded, men drilling in formation. He reported to the battalion headquarters, a commandeered farmhouse with sandbags stacked around the windows. Inside, he met Major Charles Wingo, the executive officer, a white man in his 40s with gray at his temples and tired eyes that had seen too much combat. "Lieutenant Carter, reporting for duty, sir." Wingo looked up from his maps and studied Carter for a long moment. "You're the new TC for 3rd Platoon, Baker Company. How much tank time do you have?" 400 hours at Fort Hood, sir. Top of my class in gunnery and tactics." "Fort Hood is a training ground, Lieutenant. This is the real thing. The Germans don't care about your test scores." Wingo stood and walked to the map on the wall. "We're attached to Patton's 3rd Army. We'll be moving into Belgium within the week, punching through the Siegfried Line. The German armor is better than ours, heavier, better gunned. Our Shermans are faster and we have more of them, but in a straight fight, a Panther or Tiger will kill you before you get in range." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Wingo turned to face him. "Because I've seen good men die in the first 5 minutes of their first engagement, men who thought they understood." He paused. "You're going to face challenges that white tank commanders don't face. Some of the infantry we support won't want to take orders from you. Some of our own officers will question every decision you make. Can you handle that while also keeping your crew alive?" Carter met his gaze. "I didn't come here to fail, sir." Wingo nodded slowly. "Report to Captain Miller. He commands Baker Company. He'll assign you your crew and your tank." That first meeting with Captain Miller had been brief and cold. Miller was a West Point graduate, 28 years old, from Virginia. He made it clear that Carter's assignment to his company was not his choice, and that he expected Carter to follow orders to the letter. There would be no room for initiative, no tolerance for mistakes. Carter's crew was waiting by their assigned tank when he found them. Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, the gunner, was a Mexican-American from Texas with quick hands and a quicker smile. Corporal William Mac Kenzie, the driver, was a quiet man from Detroit who could make a Sherman dance through terrain that would bog down lesser drivers. Private First Class Robert Jackson, the loader, was 19 years old, from Alabama, eager and scared in equal measure. And Private Earl Washington, the bow gunner, was a Baptist preacher's son from Georgia who quoted scripture and cleaned his .30 caliber machine gun with religious devotion. "Gentlemen," Carter said, standing before them, "I'm Lieutenant Carter. I know what you're thinking. You've been assigned a green officer who's never seen combat. That's true. But I also know this tank inside and out. I know tactics, and I know how to keep my head when things get hot. I'm going to get us through this war and back home. But I need you to trust me, follow orders, and do your jobs. Can you do that?" Rodriguez grinned. "Sir, we've been waiting 3 weeks for a tank commander. We're ready to fight." The next 2 weeks were intensive training and integration drills. Carter pushed his crew hard, running through loading drills until Jackson could slam a 75 shell into the breech in under 4 seconds. Rodriguez practiced target acquisition until he could identify German armor silhouettes at 1,000 yards. Mac ran obstacle courses until he could navigate the Sherman through terrain blindfolded. Washington cleaned and maintained his machine gun until it never jammed. They bonded during those weeks. Late-night conversations in the cold while standing watch, shared rations. The casual intimacy of men who knew their lives would soon depend on each other. Carter learned that Rodriguez had a wife and daughter back in San Antonio, that Mac had worked at the Ford plant and knew engines like some men knew their wives, that Jackson had lied about his age to enlist, that Washington wrote letters to his father every night, asking for prayers. And they learned about Carter. That he never raised his voice but commanded respect through competence. That he studied German tank tactics every night by lamplight. That he inspected every inch of their Sherman personally, never trusting maintenance to others. That he faced every slight and challenge with a calm dignity that made the bigotry seem small and petty. "Take cover." Miller's voice was tight on the radio, but there was no cover. They were in a kill box, exactly as Carter had feared. German armor opened up from both ridges, Panthers and at least one Tiger, firing down into the column. 2 more Shermans were hit in seconds, burning, their crews trying to bail out into the snow only to be cut down by machine gun fire. "Mac, hard left, get us into those trees," Carter shouted. Their Sherman lurched off the road, tracks chewing through snow, racing for the tree line. Shells were impacting all around them, throwing up geysers of frozen earth. "Tommy, target." "Panther, 11 o'clock, ridge line." "Identified. Fire!" The 75 embarked, the whole tank shaking with recoil. Carter watched through his periscope as their shells struck the Panther's front glacis and bounced off harmlessly. The German tank's turret was already traversing toward them. "Mac, reverse now!" The Sherman shot backward just as an 88 shell tore through the space they had occupied a second before. They crashed into a tree, branches raining down on the hull. "We can't hurt him from the front," Rodriguez shouted. Carter was thinking fast. They were outgunned, out-armored, in a bad position. The attack was falling apart. Half the company was already burning. Captain Miller's tank had been hit and he was screaming contradictory orders over the radio, his voice edging toward panic. And then Carter saw it. The logging trail he had studied on his map the night before. It was 50 yards to their right, barely visible through the trees. A narrow path that wound up and around the eastern ridge. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "Mac, you see that trail?" "Yes, sir." "Can you get us up it?" "In this snow, maybe it'll be tight." Carter grabbed the radio handset. "Cool stud to Baker 6, requesting permission to break from formation and attempt flanking maneuver." Static. Then Miller's voice, strained. "Negative, cool stud, maintain position." Carter looked at the burning tanks, at the men dying in the snow, at the German positions that had them pinned. He looked at his crew, Rodriguez watching him, waiting for orders, Mac's hands on the controls, Jackson standing by with another shell, Washington gripping his machine gun. He thought about every obstacle he had faced to get here, every person who had told him he didn't belong, every time he had been underestimated or dismissed, every moment of doubt he had pushed through. "Mac," he said quietly, "take us up that trail." Rodriguez grinned. "Now we're talking." The Sherman surged forward, crashing through brush, finding the narrow logging trail. It was barely wider than the tank itself, winding upward through heavy forest. Branches scraped against the hull. The grade was steep, the tracks struggling for purchase in the snow. "Come on, baby," Mac muttered, fighting the controls. "You can do this." They climbed for 10 minutes, the sounds of battle fading below them. Carter was gambling everything, his career, his crew's lives, the success of the mission, on his reading of a map and his gut instinct. If he was wrong, if this trail dead-ended or led nowhere useful, they would be isolated, possibly cut off. But if he was right, the trail leveled out, running along the ridge top. Through the trees, Carter could see down into the valley where the German armor was positioned. Panthers and one massive Tiger dug in on the western ridge, firing down into what remained of Baker Company. And from this angle, he could see their vulnerable rear armor. "Tommy, how many AP rounds we got left?" "14, sir." "Make them count. Target that Panther, the one furthest north. Wait for my command." Carter studied the geometry. They were above and behind the German position, but the moment they fired, every enemy tank would know they were there. They would get maybe 2 shots before the Germans reacted. They had to make them count. "Range 800 yards. Tommy, you ready?" "Ready, sir." "Fire." The 75 roared. Carter watched the tracer streak down. The armor-piercing shell hit the Panther's rear deck, the thinnest armor on the tank, and penetrated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Panther exploded from the inside, ammunition cooking off, the turret lifting off the hull in a grotesque metal ballet. Reload. "Mac, shift position 20 yards right. Next target, the Panther below and left." They moved quickly, Mac working the controls with the precision of a surgeon. The second Panther was already turning, its commander realizing they were being attacked from behind, but the big tank was slow to traverse and Rodriguez was faster. "On target! Fire!" Another hit, another kill. The Panther shuddered and burst into flames. Now the Germans knew they were there. The Tiger's massive turret was rotating, its 88 gun seeking them out. But the Tiger was at the bottom of the ridge and the angle was awkward for it. "That Tiger's trying to get us," Rodriguez said. "He's got the range." "Then we don't give him time to shoot. Next Panther, the one near that, knocked out Stug." They were firing and moving, Mac keeping the Sherman dancing through the trees, never staying still. Jackson was slamming shells into the breach with mechanical efficiency, not thinking, just doing. Washington was spraying machine gun fire at German infantry who were running toward their position. Carter had entered a state of perfect clarity. Everything was sharp, focused. He could see the whole battlefield in his mind, chess pieces moving. Every decision was instant, intuitive. This was what he had trained for. This was what he was meant to do. 3 more German tanks were burning now. The attack below had stalled, the surviving German armor pulling back, confused, unable to locate the American tank that was tearing through their position from an impossible angle. But they were running out of time and ammunition. The Tiger had finally gotten into position and fired. The 88 shell passed so close to Cool Stud that Carter felt the pressure wave. It struck a tree behind them and the massive trunk toppled, crashing down across the trail, cutting off their escape route. "We're blocked in." Mac shouted, "Keep moving forward, there has to be another way down." They pushed through the forest, the trail narrowing, branches tearing at the tank's sides. Behind them, German infantry was climbing the ridge. Ahead, the trail seemed to simply end at a steep embankment. "Sir, I don't think we can get down this way." Carter climbed half out of the hatch, looking. The embankment dropped 15 feet to a field below. Too steep for a controlled descent, but maybe. "Mac, can you drop us over that edge without rolling?" Mac leaned out to look. "That's crazy, sir." "Can you do it?" A pause, then, "Strap in tight, everyone." They backed up 20 yards, then Mac gunned the engine. The Sherman shot forward, hit the embankment, and went airborne for one terrifying second. They crashed down in the field below, the impact slamming Carter against the hatch ring, driving the breath from his lungs. The tank bottomed out, tracks screaming, but Mac kept the momentum going and they surged forward, somehow still upright, somehow still moving. "Everyone okay?" Carter gasped. "Jackson's got a bloody nose, but we're good," Rodriguez reported. They had come down right in the middle of the German rear area, supply trucks, command vehicles, soldiers running in panic. Washington opened up with his machine gun, Rodriguez was firing the 75 at targets of opportunity, and Mac was driving straight through them like a one-tank invasion. The surprise was total. This was not how tank warfare was supposed to work. American Shermans did not appear from nowhere in the middle of German positions. They did not drop from the sky and charge through supply lines. The Germans scattered, the carefully planned defensive position collapsing into chaos. Carter was on the radio now, calling for the rest of Baker Company to push forward to exploit the breakthrough. "Baker 6, this is Cool Stud. The German position is collapsing. Advance immediately. I say again, advance now." There was a long pause, then Captain Miller's voice stunned. "Cool Stud, what the hell are you doing back there?" Breaking their line, sir, suggest you push through before they reorganize. He could almost hear Miller's jaw working, trying to process this. Then, all Baker units advance. Follow the fire. Move, move, move. The surviving Shermans from the valley came roaring forward, smashing through the disorganized German position. The Panthers that had been dug in on the ridge were now caught between Cool Stud's rampage in their rear and the main American force to their front. One by one, they were destroyed or abandoned by their crews. The battle lasted another 20 minutes of chaos and violence. When it was finally over, when the last German tank was burning and the surviving enemy infantry was streaming back toward their own lines, Carter ordered Mac to stop. They sat in silence for a moment, the engine idling, smoke drifting across the field. Carter climbed out of the hatch and looked back at what they had done. 12 German tanks destroyed or disabled, supply trucks burning, a defensive position that should have held for days broken in less than an hour, and his crew was alive. Shaken, deafened, exhausted, but alive. The rest of Baker Company was pulling up around them. Crews were climbing out of their tanks, looking at the carnage, trying to understand what had just happened. Captain Miller's Sherman stopped 20 yards from Cool Stud. Miller climbed out slowly, his uniform scorched, his face blackened with smoke and stress. He walked over to where Carter was standing beside his tank. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other. Carter waited for the reprimand, for the anger at disobeying orders. Instead, Miller held out his hand. "That was the most insane, brilliant piece of tank combat I've ever seen, Lieutenant." Carter shook his hand, relief flooding through him. "Thank you, sir. I apologize for breaking formation, but don't apologize. You saved this company. You saw what I couldn't see, and you had the guts to act on it." Miller looked at Cool Stud, at the crew climbing out at the field of destroyed German armor. "Where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" "Books mostly, sir. Studied Rommel's tactics in North Africa. Figured if it worked for him, might work for us." Miller actually laughed, a short, shocked sound. "You're telling me you just executed a Rommel flanking maneuver with a Sherman tank on a logging trail in the middle of the Ardennes?" "Yes, sir." "Jesus Christ." Miller shook his head. "I owe you an apology, Lieutenant. I judged you before you ever had a chance to prove yourself. That was wrong." "Lot of that going around, sir." "Yeah, well, not anymore, not in my company." Miller turned to address the other tank commanders who had gathered around. "Gentlemen, you just saw what leadership looks like. Lieutenant Carter's tactical initiative broke this position. I want everyone to learn from it." That night, back at the battalion bivouac, word of the battle spread. The story got bigger, with each telling one tank breaking through impossible odds, tearing through a German position from behind. The 761st had faced skepticism from other units, questions about whether black tankers could really fight. Cool Stud's rampage answered those questions definitively, but not everyone was ready to accept it. 2 days later, Carter was called to division headquarters. He drove there in a jeep with Major Wingo, who was unusually quiet during the trip. "You know why they want to see me, sir?" Carter asked. "There's been some discussion about your actions during the attack, about whether you violated orders by breaking formation." "I see. There are some officers who think you should be disciplined, others who think you should be decorated. It's causing a bit of a stir." They arrived at a commandeered shaitou being used as headquarters. Carter was shown into an office where 3 officers waited, a colonel, a major he didn't recognize, and Captain Miller. The colonel was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the look of someone who had spent the war behind a desk. He studied Carter with open disapproval. "Lieutenant Carter, I've read the after-action reports from the engagement on the 19th. Your tank commander, Captain Miller, has recommended you for the Silver Star. However, several officers have pointed out that you directly disobeyed orders by leaving your assigned position in the attack formation. Is this accurate?" Carter stood at attention. "Sir, I requested permission to execute a flanking maneuver. When that permission was denied, I made a tactical decision based on my assessment of the battlefield situation. The main attack was failing. Our tanks were being destroyed. I saw an opportunity to change the tactical picture, and I took it. You took it upon yourself to disobey a direct order from your commanding officer. I took it upon myself to save American lives and accomplish our mission, sir." The colonel's face reddened. "That is not your decision to make, Lieutenant. We have a chain of command for a reason. If every junior officer decided to run off and do whatever they pleased—" "If I may, sir," Captain Miller stepped forward. "My order to Lieutenant Carter to maintain position was given in the heat of battle when the tactical situation was still unclear. In retrospect, it was the wrong order. Carter's initiative broke the German position and saved what was left of my company. If he had followed my orders, we would all be dead right now." "That's not the point, Captain. The point is discipline, order." The point, Colonel, is winning this war. The major spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying authority. Carter noticed he wore the combat infantryman badge and a Purple Heart. I've been reading the intelligence reports from this sector. The Germans are bringing up their best armor. We're going to be facing Tigers and Panthers and men who have been fighting since Poland. We need officers who can think, who can adapt, who can win even when the textbook says they should lose. He looked at Carter. What you did was risky. It could have failed, but you read the terrain, you read the enemy, and you executed. That's what I need more of, not less. The colonel sputtered. Sir, are you saying we should encourage insubordination? I'm saying we should encourage initiative. There's a difference. The major stood. Lieutenant Carter, you're dismissed. Your recommendation for the Silver Star is approved. Try to keep the creative tactics to situations where you're not also disobeying direct orders but keep using your head. We're going to need it. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As Carter left the shadeout with Miller, the captain clapped him on the shoulder. You just made some enemies in there. Not the first time, sir. No, I suppose not. They walked to the jeep. For what it's worth, I meant what I said. You saved us all. Over the next weeks, as the Battle of the Bulge ground on, Carter and Cool Stud became something of a legend in the 761st. Other units started requesting their support specifically. Infantry commanders who had been skeptical about black tankers asked for Carter's platoon by name. The crew of Cool Stud grew even tighter. They survived a dozen more engagements, each one adding to their reputation. Rodriguez became one of the best gunners in the battalion, his kill count climbing. Mac could thread the Sherman through terrain that stopped other tanks. Jackson and Washington worked with machine-like efficiency, and Carter proved again and again that his success in that first major battle was not luck. He had a gift for reading terrain, for anticipating enemy movements, for finding the angle that no one else saw. He led from the front, never asking his crew to take risks he wouldn't take himself. But the cost of war was always there. Carter watched friends die. He saw Shermans burn with their crews inside. He wrote letters to families telling them their sons and husbands and fathers had died bravely, even when the deaths had been anything but brave, just young men screaming as fire consumed them. There was a night in late January when the battalion was pulled back for rest and refit. Carter sat alone in a damaged building, writing in his journal by candlelight. Rodriguez found him there. You okay, sir? Just thinking, Tommy, about home, about why we're here. Rodriguez sat down beside him. You mean the irony, fighting for freedom in a country that won't let us eat at the same lunch counter? Something like that. My wife wrote me last week, told me about how she went to the movies in San Antonio and they made her sit in the Mexican section, and I'm over here fighting Nazis. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Every day, but you know what I think? Carter closed his journal. I think we're fighting two wars. One against the Germans and one back home against the people who think we're less than human because of the color of our skin or our last names. And we're going to win both of them. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but we're going to win because we're proving something every day we're here. We're proving we're just as brave, just as smart, just as American as anyone else. You really believe that? I have to. Because if this doesn't change anything, if we go home and everything's the same, then what did we die for? Rodriguez nodded slowly. Well, for what it's worth, sir, I'm glad I'm in your tank. I've served under white officers who couldn't plan their way out of a paper bag. You're the best commander I've ever had. That means a lot, Tommy. They sat in silence for a while, two men from different worlds brought together by war, bound by respect and shared danger. The war continued through February and March. The 761st pushed into Germany itself, fighting through the Siegfried Line, supporting infantry assaults on fortified towns. Carter was promoted to first lieutenant. Cool Stud took hits but kept fighting, Mac and the crew keeping her running through mechanical expertise and sheer stubbornness. Then came April 1945 and the final push into Bavaria. The battalion was assigned to help liberate a series of towns near the Austrian border. Intelligence reported minimal resistance. The Germans were falling back, their lines collapsing. It should have been routine. It wasn't. They rolled into the town of Coburg on April 12th, expecting to find it abandoned. Instead, they found an SS unit dug in and determined to fight. Fanatical teenagers and old men, the dregs of Hitler's Reich, but armed with Panzerfausts and positioned in buildings where they could ambush the tanks. The first Sherman was hit before they even realized they were in a fight. The tank brewed up in the town square, and its crew died screaming. Carter immediately ordered his platoon to spread out, to use the buildings for cover, to advance carefully. It became brutal urban combat, tanks and infantry working together to root out the SS soldiers house by house. Carter's crew was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee. They had been fighting for 5 months straight, and it showed in their reactions, in the slowness of movements that should have been automatic. They were advancing down a narrow street when Carter saw the Panzerfaust team on a second-floor balcony. Saw them, but a half-second too late. "Panzerfaust, 2 o'clock high," the German fired. The shaped charge warhead streaked toward Cool Stud. Mac jerked the controls, trying to get them out of the line of fire, but there wasn't time, wasn't space. The Panzerfaust hit the Sherman's side armor and detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. The shaped charge jet punched through the steel, and the interior of the tank became an inferno. Carter was blown clear out of the commander's hatch, thrown 15 feet onto the cobblestones. He hit hard, his head slamming against the street, and the world went white, then black, then white again. His ears were ringing. He couldn't hear, couldn't think. He rolled over and saw Cool Stud burning. The fire was already intense, black smoke pouring from the hatches, and his crew was still inside. "Tommy, Mac, Jackson, Washington." He tried to stand, but his leg wouldn't hold him. He looked down and saw blood, bone showing through torn cloth. Didn't matter. He started crawling toward the tank, toward his crew, toward his men. Someone grabbed him from behind, an infantry sergeant pulling him back. "Sir, you can't, it's going to cook off. My crew, they're gone, sir, I'm sorry, but they're gone." Carter struggled, trying to break free, but the sergeant was stronger and he was wounded and the world was spinning. He watched as the Sherman's ammunition started exploding, the tank tearing itself apart from the inside, and he knew the sergeant was right. No one could survive that. His crew, Rodriguez with his quick smile and his wife in San Antonio, Mac who could make a tank dance, young Jackson who had lied about his age to fight, Washington who quoted scripture, they were gone. The sergeant dragged him into cover just as the main gun ammunition went up with a roar that shook the street. Carter watched his tank burn, and something inside him burned with it. He spent 2 weeks in a field hospital. The leg wound was bad, but not bad enough to send him home. The doctors patched him up, told him he was lucky, told him he'd be back in action soon. Lucky, with his entire crew dead, with the men who had trusted him, who had followed him, who had become his brothers, burned alive while he survived. The war ended while he was recovering. Germany surrendered. The fighting stopped. And Carter lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it had all been for. Major Wingo visited him on May 15th, a week after VE Day. "How are you feeling, Lieutenant?" "Like I should have died with my crew, sir." Wingo pulled up a chair. He looked older, more tired. The war had aged everyone. "I know that feeling. Lost my whole company in North Africa back in '43. I was the only officer who survived. Spent a long time thinking I should have been there with them." "How did you get past it?" "I didn't, not really, but I learned to carry it differently." Wingo leaned forward. "Your crew didn't die because of anything you did wrong. They died because war is chaos and metal and fire, and sometimes the best commander in the world can't protect his men from it. You gave them every chance. You led them well. They died as soldiers, fighting an enemy that needed to be fought. Doesn't make it hurt less." "No, it doesn't, but here's what I want you to understand, Lieutenant. What you and your crew accomplished, what the 761st accomplished, it matters. Not just in this war, but for the war back home that you told Rodriguez about. Yes, I heard about that conversation. Word gets around." Carter looked at him. "You think anything's going to change?" "I think it has to. You and men like you proved something here that can't be denied. You proved that courage and skill and leadership have nothing to do with skin color. You can't put that back in the bottle. The Army's going to have to face it. The country's going to have to face it." Wingo stood. "You're getting the Silver Star for that action in December. Rodriguez, Mackenzie, Jackson, and Washington are all getting Bronze Stars posthumously. Your crew's courage is going into the official record. That matters." The medals were presented at a ceremony a month later, June 1945. Carter stood with the rest of the 761st, all of them wearing their dress uniforms, looking sharp despite everything they had been through. Generals gave speeches about valor and sacrifice. The medals were pinned on. Photographers took pictures for the newspapers back home. And Carter felt nothing but empty. He returned to the United States in August 1945, shipped home with thousands of other soldiers. The war won, the world changed. The ship docked in New York, and he walked down the gangplank with his duffel and his medals and his memories. His parents met him at the dock. His mother cried and held him. His father shook his hand with quiet pride. They took him home to Philadelphia, to the small row house where he had grown up, and tried to help him readjust to a world at peace. But Carter found that the war wouldn't let him go. He would wake up screaming, dreaming of Cool Stud burning. He would hear Rodriguez's laugh in crowds and turn, expecting to see him. He would smell diesel and cordite when there was nothing there but city air. And he found that the country he had fought for was not ready to accept what he had proven. He applied for jobs and was turned away. He went to restaurants and was told to use the back entrance. He rode buses and was told to move to the rear. One day in September, he was sitting in a park in downtown Philadelphia, staring at nothing, when an elderly black man sat down beside him on the bench. "You're one of them tankers, ain't you? I can tell by the way you carry yourself." Carter looked at him. War's over. War's never over for men like us." The old man pulled out a pipe and lit it. "I fought in the Great War, came home thinking things would be different. They weren't. But I'll tell you something, they were a little different. Not enough, but a little. And then men from your war, they'll make it a little more different. And someday, maybe not in my time, maybe not in yours, but someday it'll be different enough." "You really believe that?" "Have to. Otherwise, what was it all for?" Carter thought about Rodriguez and Mack and Jackson and Washington. About the thousands of men from the 761st who had fought and bled and died. About Captain Miller learning to see past his prejudices. About the German soldiers who had been shocked when a black tank commander's Sherman tore through their lines. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess you're right." The old man nodded and stood to leave. "You keep fighting, son. Different kind of war now, but it's still a war worth fighting." Carter sat there for a long time after the old man left. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and started walking. He didn't know where he was going exactly, but he was moving forward because that's what soldiers do. The years that followed were hard. Carter struggled with what we would now call PTSD, though in 1945 they just called it battle fatigue and expected men to get over it. He went to college on the GI Bill, became a teacher, married a woman named Grace who was patient with his nightmares and understood his silences. He testified before Congress in 1948, when President Truman was considering desegregating the military. He told them about the 761st, about the men who had fought and died proving their worth. His testimony, along with that of other black veterans, helped tip the scales. In 1950, the Army was officially desegregated. Carter read about it in the newspaper and thought about Captain Miller, about that handshake in a Belgian field, about how one man's change of heart could ripple outward. He lived long enough to see the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He marched with his students, got arrested at sit-ins, taught young people about dignity and courage and the long fight for justice. When they asked him how he stayed hopeful, he told them about the 761st, about proving the impossible. In 1978, the 761st Tank Battalion finally received the Presidential Unit citation that had been denied them after the war. Carter flew to Washington for the ceremony, one of the few surviving members of Baker Company. He stood with his fellow veterans, old men now gray-haired and slow, but still carrying themselves like the soldiers they had been. A reporter interviewed him after the ceremony. "Lieutenant Carter, how does it feel to finally be recognized?" Carter thought about Cool Stud, about his crew, about all the men who hadn't lived to see this day. "It feels like a debt being paid. Not to me, but to the men who didn't make it home. Rodriguez, Mackenzie, Jackson, Washington, all the others, they're the ones who earned this. What do you want people to remember about the 761st? I want them to remember that courage looks like all kinds of people. That leadership isn't about where you come from or what you look like. It's about what you do when everything's on the line. The men of the 761st proved that. And they proved it so well that no one could ever deny it again." James Carter died in 2004, at the age of 84. His obituary mentioned his Silver Star, his service with the 761st, his years as a teacher and civil rights activist. He was buried with full military honors. But his legacy lived on in every black officer who commanded troops without facing the automatic skepticism he had endured. In every integrated unit that fought together as Americans, not as divided races. In every history book that told the story of the Black Panthers and their fight against both the Nazis and prejudice. Now, back to where we started that frozen morning in December 1944, when Captain Miller stood before Lieutenant Carter and doubted he could lead men in combat. Miller had been wrong, but he had been wrong in a way that mattered. Because he had been able to see his mistake, to acknowledge it, to learn from it. The German soldiers who had been shocked when a black tank commander's Sherman tore through their lines had learned a hard lesson about underestimating your enemy. But the more important lesson was learned by Americans, that the content of a man's character and the quality of his leadership had nothing to do with the color of his skin. It took a war to prove it. It took men dying in burning tanks. It took courage in the face of enemy fire and in the face of home front bigotry. It took time, far too much time, but it was proven. In snow and mud and blood it was proven, and once proven it could never be fully taken back. The door that Carter and the men of the 761st kicked open never fully closed again. Every advance in civil rights that followed, every barrier broken, every prejudice challenged, they all stood on the foundation built by men like Carter and his crew. The mathematics of justice are slow but inexorable. What was proven true on the battlefield in 1944 eventually had to be acknowledged in law, in society, in the hearts and minds of people who had been taught to think otherwise. Cool stud burned in a German street in April 1945. But the fire it lit, the fire of proof through action, of courage undeniable, of leadership unquestionable, that fire burned on. It burns still in every person who refuses to accept that their worth is determined by anything other than their actions and their character. Lieutenant James Carter would have said he was just doing his job, following his training, taking care of his crew. He would have deflected any attempt to make him a symbol or a hero. But history doesn't care what we think of ourselves. It cares what we do and what our actions mean to those who come after. And what Carter did, what he and his crew and the entire 761st did echoes through generations. That's the real victory. Not the ground taken or the enemy tanks destroyed, but the minds changed, the doors opened, the impossible made possible. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.